today, which is titled Proactively Evaluating and Improving the Quality of Clinical Trial Registration Data to Meet the Needs of Registries and the Patient. Today we'll just give you an overview of TransCelerate's clinical trial registration tool. Next slide, please. My name is Anthony Brogno. I'm the program manager overseeing this initiative and all of our patient-focused initiatives at TransCelerate. On the line with me today is Mike Vaughn and Amber Williams, who provide project management support for this initiative, as well as providing support for polling questions today. Next slide, please. Our two expert presenters who work on the Clinical Research Access Initiative is Keir Hodge and Ramona Roig. They will both be going into some of the details behind our tool, why we created it, and its necessity to help improve information for patients and for sponsors. Next slide, please. So please note that all lines have been muted to ensure a pleasant listening experience for all attendees. You may reduce the GoToWebinar control panel by clicking on the orange and white arrow in the upper right corner. We welcome questions throughout the discussion. Those can be easily submitted using the questions function you should see in your control panel. Be sure to select send after typing your question in the box. Another note to be aware of is that this webinar may be recorded in whole or in part. If you do not consent to be recorded, please send a note using the questions panel. Next slide. So we'll be using the GoToWebinar polling function during today's webinar. Your participation is voluntary and all responses are anonymous. Aggregated answers are shown as a percentage of all respondents. To test out this system and to ensure our audio is working properly, we will launch our test question. So if you could just respond to the test question. Okay, great. I'll close it out. And you can see we have the results calculated here. So thank you. It looks like this feature is working properly. So we can go ahead with the next slide. So just wanted to go over some ground rules really to help make this discussion helpful and to answer as many questions as we can. So again, just some items to consider for today's webinar. Participation is voluntary, as is using any of TransCelerate's assets or tools. The responsibility for compliance with laws and regulations is owned by the solution adopter. You don't have to identify what company you work for during this webinar. Some items that we would ask you not to discuss as part of the questions and answer session at the end are related to, what vendors, sites, or CROs you are using or not using, any issues you have with any vendors, sites, or CROs, any of your long-term development plans, or anything related to costs. And some things that we can't answer questions about, again, we will not answer questions as they pertain to vendors, cost of using or implementing any of TransCelerate's assets or tools, and answering questions around which member companies are using specific assets or tools. Next slide. So just a brief overview of our agenda. I will give you a brief intro to TransCelerate and provide an overview of that. Then we'll hand it over to Keir, who will do a deeper dive into clinical research access and information exchange and our assets. And then we'll go a deeper dive into our clinical trial registration tool. And then just do a walkthrough of the tool more thoroughly to provide all the information necessary for tool usage. And then we will allow 10 minutes at the end of the session for a quick Q&A panel. Next slide, please. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so just one of these questions that we have that we'd like to kick off this section with is just to please indicate which response best applies to you. Are you representing a patient advocacy group, a research center or hospital, a CRO service provider? Are you working for an industry sponsor or other? Prefer not to answer. And again, I think understanding this information will help Keir and Ramona deliver the best information possible as it relates to the organization you represent. Okay, we have about 65% of the voting in. I'm going to close the polling in a few seconds. Okay. Thank you for providing that information. And as we, I don't want to say we expected, but as we thought, industry sponsors, including TransCelerate member companies, are of the highest representation, as well as CRO service providers and others. So thank you for sharing that information with us. Okay, so again, TransCelerate, for those of you not aware, is a nonprofit organization really centered around fostering collaboration. And really our vision is to improve the health of people around the world by accelerating and simplifying the R&D process. Next slide. Really the main takeaways of this slide is that, TransCelerate was founded 8 years ago in 2012 with only 10 member companies and only 5 initiatives. Today, we stand over 21 member companies. We have 21 member companies and over 25 initiatives that we focus on. So quite the substantial growth in the last 8 years. Next slide, please. TransCelerate, again, its 25 initiatives are broken down into 3 different categories. The first one off to your left is harmonizing process and sharing information. The second one on your right is improving the patient and site experience. And the third one below is enhancing sponsor efficiency and drug safety. And as for today's call, we'll be focusing in on the assets created by the Clinical Research Access and Information Exchange Initiative. Next slide. Okay, so I will hand it off to Keir, and he will do a deeper dive into our initiative. Keir?
Thanks, Anthony. So, I'm going to cover some slides that take you on the journey of our work stream over the last 4 years or so, before handing over to Ramona, who's going to take you through the details of how to use the clinical trial registration tool. So, next slide, please. So, over the last 4 years since we formed, we've been focused on areas that improve the experience for patients of finding and also participating in a trial. The 4 items on this list, if I start from the bottom, where we actually created some communication templates, which are free to download off the TransCelerate website, but they effectively allow sites and sponsors to say thanks and provide information to patients when they join a trial, when they're ongoing in a trial, and then when they finish a trial, because this is something that's very simple to do that has a high impact for patients to know their participation is valued. The item above, the site contacts options paper, was something we developed a few years ago, which is looking at the clinical trial registries and what are the best options to connect patients interested in a trial to the site that's actually performing the trial. And there are a number of different options which are described in this paper, which can help your organization decide what to do. A more direct asset that we produced regarding the registries was the proposal and proof of concept for the clinical trial registry of the future. So we did a white paper, and we also created a wireframe website illustrating what a clinical trial registry could look like if you made it with the patient fully in mind. So we consulted with patients throughout the whole process of developing this, and we were hoping that we would get some adoption by government registries. And then what we're talking about today, which is the Common Registry Data Packet, and that's more focused on the quality of the data that we as sponsors provide on the registries. And this is broken into 2 assets, one of which is a manuscript that we're hoping to publish this year. And what we're talking about today is the Clinical Trial Registration Tool, which is an Excel tool that helps you actually proactively improve the information you put on the registries. Moving on. So effectively, we have a goal of improving the design and quality of the major registries to increase accessibility to clinical trials. And over the years, we've come to the realization that this is kind of composed in 2 elements. On the right-hand side, you can see the design, and that's what we did with the Registry of the Future. So this is like the front end of the registries. And then on the left-hand side, the symbiotic relationship that exists between the quality and the design is kind of really important. And that's why we created the Common Registry Data Packet. So we're focusing on the quality of the data and also the design of the registries. Moving on. So why improve accessibility to clinical trials via the registries? Well, we know from talking to patients and our survey results that clinical trial registries have the potential to be really meaningful resources for patients, but there are certain limiting factors that you're probably well aware of, such as the lack of quality of the data and the scientific jargon that we often, as sponsors, put on the registries. And this limits their uses for patients. The Common Registry Data Packet aims to improve the quality of this data, and we've tried to make sure that that is both in terms of adhering to the guidance that the registries define, while also reflecting the information that patients want. And the last point, which is very important to our work stream, is this was actually an asset that was produced in response to NIH's concerns that the quality of the data on the registries is almost a precursor to engaging with us about the Registry of the Future concept. Because at the moment they spend so much of their time working on quality issues on the data that they really don't have the capacity to look into these other things like Registry of the Future. So, moving on. Okay, so how do we approach creation of this clinical trial registration tool that we're presenting today? Well, we started at the beginning with our experimental question, which in this case was, what is the current standard or the current quality of data on the registries, as defined by the NIH requirements and also according to the patient's perspective of quality. And then the second part of that, before we started, was to define what quality is in this context. And we defined it as on a per data field basis as a function of both the form and the content of that data. We then needed to actually understand what the patient preferences were. So we spoke with patients via patient advisory boards, and we performed a global survey where we identified what the high utility data fields are on the registries, and also what patients' preferences were in terms of the data field content and the format. With the patient preferences in our hand, we then were able to create analytical frameworks, which were comprised of two elements. There was the patient preference side of things, and then there was also the compliance to the NIH requirements on the registries. And with these frameworks, we were then able to apply them and actually score a subset of trials that we downloaded from clinicaltrials.gov to actually analyze what the current state of quality is. So next slide, please. And then just a couple of slides to describe the results that we got from our patient survey. So this was a global survey of around 1,000 respondents, and out of those approximately 1,000 respondents, we had about 22% who had experience of using clinical trial registries. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the most visited website out of these patients was clinicaltrials.gov, which may not be a surprise. But I think one of the interesting things is that this was a global survey. It was translated into Japanese, German, and Spanish, and yet even then, still, clinicaltrials.gov was at the top of that list. So it gave us confidence that we were on the right path. Next slide, please. And so here you can see the results, the surveys, the participants ranked in terms of the free text fields in the registries, which are most helpful when evaluating clinical trials. The two that we actually chose to focus on for our tool were the brief title and the brief summary, as we felt these gave us the biggest scope to actually improve the quality of data on the registries. They're very broad fields, and they give us a lot of scope to actually provide all the information that the patients want. Next slide, please. So here we can see an example of our analytical framework on the brief title. It's quite busy, and I'm not going to go through the entire slide. I just want to make it clear that on the left-hand side, these questions under the adherence assessment questions are the NIH guidance that we took and were able to turn into this analytical framework. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the questions that came from the patient surveys and our patient advisory boards, which are slightly different. There are some questions you'll notice that are actually the same across both the NIH requirements and the patient preferences, and these are highlighted in green, but there are also unique elements to either. So there are differences with what the NIH requires and what patients want. An example on the right would be the top question of, are the age parameters for participants provided? Because patients told us they really want to find out as quickly as possible if they would be eligible, or it's possible that they could start screening for a trial. Moving on. And so the same again, this is the same analytical framework but applied to the brief summary. And there are different criteria and different questions being asked, but it's the same principle. On the left, we have the NIH requirements. On the right, we have the patient-focused preferences. And just some kind of, they seem obvious now when we look at them, but there's something that we typically don't provide in the brief summary, but patients are really interested to know how long the clinical trial drug would be given. And they're also very interested to know how frequent the visits would be on the trial. And this is something that we can, generally speaking, quite easily add to the brief summaries, but we currently don't tend to do it. Moving on. And then just here are some of the results of our analysis based on our sample of 346 studies downloaded from clinicaltrials.gov. Regarding the brief title, two positive points that we noted was that most make mention of the condition and scope for the trial, so that's a good thing. Many diligently exclude technical design study terms, which is also a very good thing. On the negative side, very few leverage the term participant, which is the recommended term that the NIH would like us to use in the brief title. With regards to the brief summary, most use complete sentences, another good thing. But on the negative side, roughly a quarter make no mention to the objective or purpose of the trial. Moving on. This is just the same data represented graphically, like in terms of the numbers that we saw, where on the left-hand side we look at the brief title, where 0 is a really bad score and 7 is the top score, and you can see a distribution across the numbers. But in summary, we can do better. These aren't perfect scores, and it's something that we can work on. And we don't have the. It's okay. We can carry on. That's fine. In terms of what we're actually presenting today, we're going to have a look at the registration tool, which is something that is free to use for anyone to download. And we also are going to look very briefly at the manuscript, which we're hoping to publish in the coming 2 to 3 months, which kind of summarizes in more detail our research on the current state of registration data quality according to the NIH and the patient preferences. Next slide, please. So the clinical trial registration tool, the purpose of the tool, so we want to allow or enable sponsors to proactively evaluate the quality of their registration data that they submit to government-owned registries and potentially improve that data. As it stands today, it's a proof of concept tool limited at the moment to the brief title and the brief summary data fields. It exists as a macro-enabled Excel file. It also features readability grades and scores for the brief summary, which may help give you an idea of how easy it will be for the public to understand your brief summary. And quite exciting for our team at the moment, we're looking to future versions of the tool, which we're hoping to link to another one of TransCelerate's initiatives of the Common Protocol template, where we can kind of extract data directly from the protocol into the registration data sets, which we think may really help embed this patient-centric approach. Next slide, please. And then just a short statement on our manuscript. So this is an excerpt from our conclusion, and I just want to read verbatim the last sentence on here from the conclusion. So sponsors need to take action for making evaluation of clinical trials easier for patients and other registry users, and should more fully adhere to clinicaltrials.gov guidance. And I think this is a really powerful thing, because we as sponsors have the power to make things better on the registries, and that's what I think the manuscript will make clear. Next slide. And so now I'm going to hand over to Ramona, who's going to actually walk you through the tool itself, and hopefully you'll all be able to download and use it whenever you wish afterwards.
Thanks very much, Kier. I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this first slide is an example of how the brief title looks within the tool itself without any data entered. And what I'll do through the next few slides is walk you through the content and functionality of this tool. Next slide. So once a user of the tool enters the brief title, the automatic calculations auto-populate. You will see the automated calculations at the bottom of the screen. Elements of the brief title that meet NIH adherence criteria and patient preferences are depicted in green. Elements of the brief title that do not meet expectations are depicted in red. The tool will automatically determine whether periods are excluded, technical design terms are excluded, information on the participant is included, the term participant is included, the age of the participant is included, and the presence of the intervention form is stated. The next slide. So the next step is to select the appropriate response to each question under the manual assessment. The tool does not assess the presence or absence of these elements for you. So to produce a final assessment, enter yes or no to confirm if all abbreviations are defined, the condition is stated, the intervention name is stated, and the description of health measurements is stated. And again, those are the tools, the rows at the top that you'll see there under manual assessment. Next slide. So once your manual assessment is complete, the tool will provide a brief title adherence assessment and a brief title patient focus assessment. If the outcome of either assessment is deficient, the rationale will be provided. So you see there within the red box on the screen, the smaller blue boxes calculate what was entered under manual assessment and automated calculations, and then anything that's deficient within that calculation will be provided under rationale. Next slide. So in this example, you will see how slight changes to the brief title can improve the assessment outcome. In this example, we've removed parallel group treatment, phase 2, participant, and investigator masked from the title. It's a little bit small to see on this slide. With these technical design terms removed from the brief title, the quality of our adherence and patient focus assessments improved. And you can see that within those small blue boxes. Next slide. If I was to give a numerical value to each assessment, you can see the brief title in the second example scored 7 out of 7 for NIH adherence and 5 out of 7 for patient focus. And the next slide. So this is a simplified depiction of how the clinical trial registration tool may be used for a clinical trial. Our clinical trial disclosure lead, Samantha, is responsible for drafting the registration for a new clinical trial. So first, Samantha drafts the brief title and the brief summary. In some companies, the content for these registration fields may be provided by other departments like medical writing. Next, Samantha copies and pastes the brief title and brief summary into the clinical trial registration tool, and she completes the manual assessment criteria. Then the tool provides Samantha with an outcome assessment of each field. Based on this assessment, Samantha may choose to revise the brief title or brief summary in order to improve the quality of each field. Finally, Samantha submits the clinical trial registration using the updated brief title and brief summary. By using the tool, she can be confident she's working to improve patient access to clinical trial information. And the next slide. So these next few slides just cover a few implementation considerations for your companies. So key stakeholders who may benefit from this tool include patients, sponsors, and the NIH. For example, when the brief title or brief summary is clear and easy to understand, patients may be more informed and more inclined to participate in clinical trials. And of course, this would benefit sponsors too. Not only can the tool help improve quality and consistency of registration data, it can help you formulate a brief title and brief summary that are suitable across numerous clinical documents like the informed consent and lay summary. And again, as Keir mentioned, the common protocol template. Ultimately, we hope to reduce the amount of time that's spent by NIH on QA review. And the next slide. Here you will see a few adoption considerations. These are just questions to think about as you work to determine if the tool will help improve the quality of registrations at your site. So finally, we can say the tool is publicly available. And again, these are a few steps you might want to consider. So this slide provides suggestions on how you can gain leadership support. Additionally, clear roles and responsibilities are important to avoid duplication of effort and to ensure the greatest possible benefit from using the tool. Each company and department involved in registering studies may use the tool differently, and we realize that different departments have different responsibilities related to the global registries. So number 3 on this slide describes use of the tool and considerations that will help you through this decision process. So now that I've walked you through the use of the tool and considerations for adopting the tool at your company, I would like to ask Anthony and Keir to open the audience poll.
Great. So I think the first audience poll that we have to run is following the question, so do you believe that your organization would utilize this tool for registration submissions? We want to know a yes, a no, I don't know, or I need more information. We'll just let that run for a few seconds. And the results are in. And we have a mixture of enthusiasm, some tentative responses. So that's interesting. Maybe within the Q&A we can learn more about the I don't knows. Good. So moving on to the next polling question. So the question is, would adoption of this tool be more likely when incorporated into a protocol authoring tool, such as the common protocol template? And we want to know yes, no, or this is not applicable within your role. The results are in, and we have a majority with the yes, which is really nice to hear because it gives us confidence that we're moving in the right direction. We're trying to integrate this tool into the protocol templates. So that's good to hear. Okay. And then just to close out on the slides on the clinical trial registration tool, we want to take a moment just to thank all of the contributing member companies who've provided resources and been working hard over the last year, putting together the research and developing the tool. And also in the bottom left, you can see we've also wanted to thank the patient advisory boards, which have really given us great advice on which direction we should be going. And we also have a patient advisor that's permanently on our team who's been great at just keeping us in check the whole way through this process. So a big thanks to everyone who contributed. And then I think we have a pretty good amount of time for Q&A. I think that's a great opportunity to try and clear up any ambiguity that exists on the tool. So, Amber, do you have any questions on the line?
Yep, at this time we're going to open it up for questions and answers. Thank you very much to our expert speakers, Kier and Ramona. As a reminder, if you do have any questions, please type them into the control panel. The first question, Kier and Ramona,